The dream always began the same way. I stood at the edge of a bridge, its dark wooden planks worn and warped, stretching across an endless chasm of swirling mist. Massive iron chains hung from the heavens, supporting the structure as it groaned under its own weight. Beneath the bridge, far below in the darkness, faint pinpricks of light shimmered, tiny, distant, and yet uncomfortably alive. They seemed to pulse like living things, like fireflies trapped in tar that I never moved. I only stood there, frozen by a fear I couldn't name. My legs felt like lead, and my breath hitched in my throat. The mist whispered to me, soft voices murmuring words I could never understand. The bridge loomed, its infinite length shrouded in shadows, and then I'd wake up, drenched in sweat, the whispers still echoing faintly in my ears. For weeks, the dream tormented me. Each night it became more vivid, the details sharper, more oppressive. At first I could dismiss it as nothing more than a recurring nightmare. But as the days turned into weeks, I began to notice things, small, unsettling details that followed me into my waking life. That it started with the black mark point one morning. After yet another night spent staring at the bridge, I woke up to find a thin, dark smudge streaking across my palm. It looked like ink, but no amount of scrubbing could remove it. The more I tried, the more the mark seemed to deepen, as if it had seeped into my skin. Then there were the whispers. Faint at first, almost imperceptible, like the rustling of leaves or the murmur of a distant crowd. They came at odd times, when I was alone in my apartment or walking home late at night, always just on the edge of hearing, impossible to make out yet impossible to ignore. By the second week, the dream began to intrude into my waking world. I'd catch glimpses of the bridge in the strangest places, reflected in the glass of a passing car, or faintly sketched in the shadows of an alleyway. It was never fully there, never something I could focus on, but its presence was unmistakable. That I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Stress, maybe, or too many late nights scrolling through the internet, filling my head with creepy stories. But deep down, I knew better. The bridge wasn't just in my dreams anymore. That I first noticed the shift in the world on an otherwise ordinary morning. I was walking to work, my breath puffing in the cold November air, when I felt it, a subtle change in the light. The sky was overcast, the sun hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds, but the shadows on the ground didn't match the gray of the day. They were darker, sharper, almost too real. That I stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, staring down at my own shadow. It stretched unnaturally long, the edges jagged, as if something had torn it apart and stitched it back together wrong. The people around me didn't seem to notice. They moved past me in a blur, their faces expressionless, their eyes dull. "Michael?" The whisper came from nowhere and everywhere all at once, a soft, sibilant sound that sent a shiver down my spine. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was no one there, just the endless stream of faceless strangers, their footsteps echoing against the pavement. I hurried the rest of the way to work, my pulse racing. But even in the fluorescent-lit office, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every reflection, windows, computer screens, even the surface of my coffee, seemed to hold faint, flickering images of the bridge. And then there was the clock. It was just after 10 a.m. when I noticed it. The office clock above my desk, a cheap plastic thing, had stopped ticking. The hands were frozen at 12:01, but the second hand twitched spasmodically, like something trapped. "Great," I muttered, trying to ignore the unease curling in my gut. But when I glanced back a few minutes later, the clock had changed. The hands now pointed backward, 11:59, and the numbers on the face were shifting, rearranging themselves into strange, unfamiliar symbols. That was the moment I realized I wasn't imagining things. That night, I dreamed of the bridge again. This time, I wasn't alone. The figure stood in the middle of the bridge, its form cloaked in shadow. It was tall, almost inhumanly so, and its edges seemed to blur and shift, as though it wasn't entirely solid. Its head tilted slightly, as if it were studying me. "Michael," it said, its voice low and resonant, vibrating deep in my chest. "You've been chosen." "For what?" I managed to croak, my throat dry and my legs trembling. "To cross," it said simply. That I wanted to wake up. I wanted to turn and run, but my feet wouldn't obey me. The figure raised one long, shadowy arm and pointed toward the far end of the bridge, where the mist coiled and twisted like living smoke. "Once you cross, "There is no turning back," it said. "Do you understand?" I nodded, though I didn't. The figure lowered its arm and stepped aside, its form dissolving into the shadows. The path ahead was clear, the bridge stretching endlessly into the void. I felt a pull deep in my chest, an almost magnetic force drawing me forward, and for the first time, I took a step. The wood creaked beneath my weight, and the air grew heavier, charged with an electric tension. The lights below the bridge pulsed brighter, casting faint, flickering patterns on the underside of the planks. That I took another step, and another. The mist thickened, swirling around me in cold, damp tendrils. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, their fragmented words curling around my ears. Then I saw them, eyes, dozens of them, glowing faintly in the darkness beneath the bridge. They blinked in unison, their unblinking gaze fixed on me. Watching my every move, I froze, terror rooting me to the spot. The whispers rose to a crescendo, a cacophony of voices all speaking at once, their words overlapping in a chaotic symphony. "Cross," they said. "Cross the bridge." I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out, and then I woke up. But the mark on my palm was darker now, spreading up my wrist like veins of black ink. I woke to a room drenched in shadows, the early morning light barely filtering through the blinds. For a moment, I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to shake the remnants of the dream. My heart still raced, and my palm burned like fire. When I finally dared to look at my hand, I wished I hadn't. The black mark was no longer a thin streak. It had spread overnight, branching out into jagged lines that wrapped around my wrist and crept up toward my elbow. The lines pulsed faintly, as though they were alive. I tried scrubbing it again, this time with scalding water and soap, but it was useless. The marks were under my skin, like they had become part of me. Cross the bridge. The whispers from the dream echoed in my mind. I told myself it wasn't real, couldn't be real. But deep down, I knew better. The day dragged on in a haze. At work, I barely managed to keep my focus. My co-workers seemed distant, their voices muffled, as if I were underwater. Even the office itself looked wrong. The colors were off, muted and gray, and the shadows on the walls seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. By lunchtime, I couldn't take it anymore. I told my boss I wasn't feeling well and left early, ignoring the strange looks from my coworkers. As I stepped onto the street, the city felt different. The air was heavy, oppressive, and the usual noise of traffic and chatter was muffled, as if the world had been wrapped in cotton. The shadows of buildings stretched unnaturally long, twisting into shapes that didn't belong. And then there was the bridge. I saw it again as I turned onto my street. It rose from the pavement like a mirage, its dark planks gleaming wetly in the pale light. The chains that supported it swayed gently, though there was no wind. I blinked, and it was gone. When I reached my apartment, the atmosphere was stifling, the air thick and cold. I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, trying to steady my breathing. My reflection in the hallway mirror caught my attention. At first, it seemed normal, just me, pale and tired. But as I stared, something shifted. My reflection's eyes darkened, the irises turning pitch black. The corners of its mouth curled into a faint, knowing smile. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. When I looked again, the reflection was normal, my own wide eyes staring back at me in fear. I didn't stay to look longer. That night, I didn't want to sleep. I was afraid of what I'd see, of where the dream might take me. But no matter how hard I tried to stay awake, exhaustion eventually won. I found myself standing on the bridge again. This time, I didn't hesitate. The pull was stronger now, irresistible, and the figure from before was waiting for me in the middle of the bridge. "You're ready?" it said, its voice a deep vibration that echoed in my bones. "For what?" I asked, my voice trembling. "To cross," it replied. The mist parted, revealing the far end of the bridge. The planks disappeared into the shadows, and beyond them was something vast and dark, pulsating faintly like a living thing. The lights below the bridge grew brighter, their unblinking eyes fixed on me. I wanted to run. I wanted to wake up, but I couldn't. I took a step forward. The figure watched, its head tilting slightly, as if amused. The whispers around me grew louder, their words overlapping in a chaotic chorus. As I reached the midpoint of the bridge, the air grew heavier, thicker, until every breath felt like a struggle. The mist coiled around me, seeping into my skin, and the shadows beneath the bridge surged upward, reaching for me with inky tendrils. And then I saw it, the source of the lights below. The eyes, they weren't reflections. They weren't hallucinations. They were alive. Thousands of them floated beneath the surface of the black water, each one glowing faintly, their irises swirling with impossible colors. They stared up at me, unblinking, their gaze filled with a terrible hunger. "Do not stop," the figure's voice commanded, but I couldn't move. The eyes began to rise, breaking the surface of the water. Something emerged with them. A massive, shapeless thing covered in writhing tendrils and slick, glistening flesh. The tendrils reached for the bridge. For me, their tips twitching with anticipation. "Do not stop," the voice repeated, more insistent this time that I forced myself to move, dragging one foot forward, then the other. The thing in the water let out a low, guttural sound, a noise that vibrated through my entire body. And then, just as the tendrils brushed the edge of the bridge, I woke up. The first thing I noticed was the silence that it was deep, unnatural, and absolute. No cars honking outside, no faint hum of the refrigerator, no distant murmur of the neighbor's television. I sat up in bed, my chest heaving, and looked around at my apartment was the same, but different. The walls seemed darker, the shadows deeper. The air was colder, heavier, and on the ceiling, etched in faint, glowing lines, was the bridge. It stretched from one end of the room to the other, its planks shimmering faintly in the dim light. The chains hung down like skeletal arms, swaying gently as if caught in a phantom breeze. I stared at it, my heart pounding, and then I heard the voice. "You've crossed," it said, soft and satisfied. "And now the world will follow." The silence pressed against my ears like cotton, amplifying every faint sound I made. My breaths, shallow and rapid. The soft creak of the bed as I shifted. The almost imperceptible swish of the chains on the ceiling bridge. I didn't want to believe it was real. My brain scrambled for rational explanations. Hallucination, stress, exhaustion. But no matter how hard I blinked or rubbed my eyes, the bridge remained, etched into the ceiling like an impossible scar. Its faint glow cast eerie, shifting shadows across the room, and my gut twisted with a primal fear I couldn't shake that I had crossed. And whatever I'd awakened was here now. The world outside wasn't the same. The next morning, I stepped out of my apartment to find the city bathed in an unnatural light. The sun hung in the sky, but its warmth was gone, replaced by a cold, greenish hue that washed over everything like a toxic filter. Shadows stretched too long and too dark, twisting into jagged shapes that writhed like living things when you weren't looking directly at them. People were different, too. They moved slower, their faces blank and pale, their eyes distant as if they were staring through the world instead of at it. Occasionally, one of them would stop mid-step, their head tilting slightly as though listening to something only they could hear. Then they would move again, their pace mechanical, almost robotic. I hurried down the street, clutching my jacket tight against the chill in the air. The whispers had started again, faint and fragmented, barely louder than the sound of my own breathing. I tried to ignore them, but they pressed against my thoughts like a persistent itch. "Michael," they hissed. "Come closer." When I glanced over my shoulder, I caught a glimpse of the bridge again. It shimmered faintly in the reflection of a store window, its planks stretching endlessly into the distance. I looked away, my pulse racing. By midday, the changes were undeniable. The streets had emptied, the few remaining people moving in jerky, unnatural motions. The city felt like a hollow shell, its familiar sounds replaced by an eerie hum that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The shadows continued to grow, pooling in corners and stretching across walls like ink spilled in slow motion. They moved when I wasn't looking, inching closer, their shapes twisting into grotesque forms that made my stomach churn. And then, as I passed through the park near my apartment, I saw it again. The bridge. This time it wasn't a fleeting reflection or a half glimpse in the corner of my eye. It was fully there, rising from the mist that clung to the ground like a living thing. Its planks glistened wetly, and the iron chains creaked softly as they swayed. The faint lights below pulsed in rhythm, their glow casting faint ripples across the black water beneath. I stopped, frozen in place. My instincts screamed at me to turn and run, but something deeper pulled me forward. The whispers grew louder. "Come back," they said. "You've crossed once. Cross again." I shook my head, stumbling backward. My foot caught on the edge of a cracked pavement stone, and I fell hard onto the ground, the impact jolting through my body. When I looked up, the bridge was gone. But something else was there. The figure stood at the edge of the clearing, its tall, shadowy form blending into the mist. It was the same as the one from my dreams. Cloaked in darkness, its edges shifting and blurring like smoke. It didn't speak this time. It only stared, its head tilting slightly as if observing me. "What do you want?" I managed to croak, my voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised one long, shadowy arm and pointed toward the spot where the bridge had been. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "I'm not going back. I didn't mean to cross, whatever this is. I didn't mean it." The figure didn't move. Its arm remained extended, its gesture as silent and unyielding as a command. And then the shadows around it began to shift. They rippled and coalesced, forming shapes, figures, humanoid but wrong. Their limbs were too long, their joints bending in ways that defied logic. Their heads tilted at unnatural angles, their hollow eyes fixed on me. They began to move, slowly at first, their twisted forms dragging through the mist like broken marionettes. Then faster, their limbs skittering and snapping as they advanced. Panic surged through me, and I scrambled to my feet, turning and running as fast as I could. The city wasn't the same anymore. As I sprinted down the empty streets, I saw them. More of the shadowy figures emerging from alleyways and side streets, their unnatural shapes filling the city like an invading force. They didn't chase me directly, but their presence pressed against me, hurting me, guiding me toward the bridge. Every reflection, every shadow, every surface seemed to hold glimpses of it. The bridge was everywhere, its dark, twisted form etched into the very fabric of reality. I couldn't escape it. When I reached my apartment, I slammed the door shut and locked it, leaning against it as though the flimsy wood could keep the darkness at bay. My chest heaved, and my limbs trembled with exhaustion. But the whispers were still there, louder now, filling the room with their insistent murmur. "You've crossed," they said. "You belong. Come back." The black marks on my arm throbbed painfully, spreading farther now, their jagged lines branching up toward my shoulder. I stumbled into the bathroom, gripping the sink for support. My reflection stared back at me, pale and wild-eyed. But it wasn't just my reflection. The bridge was there, too, faint and ghostly, its planks stretching across the mirror's surface, and behind it, the eyes, thousands of them, glowing faintly in the darkness, their unblinking gaze fixed on me. That night, the bridge came to me again, but I didn't dream this time. When I opened my eyes, it was there, looming in the middle of my apartment, its chains swaying and its planks creaking softly. The whispers filled the room, deafening now. "Cross," they said. "You cannot escape. Cross." I stared at the bridge, my breath hitching. And then, as if in a trance, I took a step forward. The moment my foot touched the first plank, the air shifted. The oppressive silence of my apartment dissolved into a cacophony of whispers, overlapping and chaotic, their meanings slipping just out of reach. A cold wind rushed past me, carrying the scent of damp earth and something metallic, like blood that I tried to stop, to pull back, but my body wouldn't obey. My legs moved of their own accord, dragging me forward step by step. The bridge stretched endlessly ahead, its planks gleaming wetly in the dim, otherworldly light. Behind me, the apartment faded away. When I glanced over my shoulder, there was nothing but the swirling mist, its tendrils coiling hungrily toward the edges of the bridge. The whispers grew louder, forming a rhythmic chant that reverberated through my skull. "Cross, cross, cross." I clutched the railing for balance, the rough wood biting into my palms. The bridge creaked beneath me, swaying gently as though alive. My pulse pounded in my ears, and the black veins snaking up my arm throbbed in time with the whispers. Then I heard it. A low, guttural sound that vibrated through the planks. At first, it was distant, almost imperceptible. But as I continued forward, it grew louder, a deep, resonant growl that seemed to come from the very depths of the void below. The faint lights in the water, those terrible, unblinking eyes, brightened, their glow casting eerie shadows on the underside of the bridge. The growl shifted into a series of clicks and hisses, a language that felt ancient and wrong. My stomach churned, and my legs trembled, but I couldn't stop moving. Then it rose. The creature emerged from the black water with a sickening slowness, its massive, amorphous body glistening as it broke the surface. Tendrils writhed and twisted, each one tipped with razor-sharp barbs. Eyes, hundreds of them, covered its body, their glowing irises swirling with impossible colors that I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The thing let out a low, rumbling sound, and its eyes locked onto me, all of them moving in unison like a single malevolent entity. "Do not falter," the voice from my dreams commanded, sharp and urgent. The shadowy figure stood ahead, its form barely visible through the mist. It raised one long, dark arm, pointing to the far end of the bridge. "Keep moving. You are bound to the path now." I didn't know what waited at the end of the bridge, but I knew instinctively that stopping wasn't an option. The creature's tendrils reached for the bridge, their movements slow and deliberate, testing the wood as if gauging its strength. That I forced myself to take another step, then another, my legs trembling with every movement. The whispers around me began to change, their chaotic murmurs transforming into something more rhythmic, almost like a chant. The words were foreign, their meaning lost to me, but the sound burrowed into my mind, carving out space where only terror had been before. As I moved forward, the creature beneath the bridge grew more agitated. Its tendrils lashed against the chains, sending tremors through the structure. The bridge groaned and swayed, and I clung to the railing, my knuckles white. "You must not stop," the figure said again, its voice cutting through the noise. The creature let out a deafening roar, a sound so deep and guttural that it felt as though the very air had been torn apart. The lights below flickered and surged, their glow casting grotesque shadows that danced and twisted on the mist. I pressed forward, my every step an act of sheer will. Halfway across, the bridge began to change. The wood beneath my feet darkened, its surface slick with something wet and sticky. The air grew heavier, thicker, as though the mist itself was pressing down on me. My chest tightened, and each breath felt like a struggle. The black veins on my arm pulsed painfully, spreading farther up my shoulder and down my chest. I could feel them burrowing into me, their cold tendrils threading through my veins, and then the whispers became clear. "Michael," they said, my name curling in the air like smoke. "You are chosen. You will be the bridge." "The bridge," I whispered hoarsely, my voice barely audible over the noise. The shadowy figure nodded, its form shifting and blurring as though it were struggling to maintain its shape. "You have crossed between worlds," it said. "Now you must anchor them." "I don't understand," I said, my voice rising with panic. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't want this." The figure tilted its head, its shadowy form crackling with faint electric energy. "You were called," it said simply, "and you answered." The far end of the bridge came into view, shrouded in thick, swirling mist. Shapes moved within it, vague, indistinct forms that seemed to ripple and shift like water. The creature below let out another roar, and the entire bridge shuddered. Its tendrils lashed out, wrapping around the chains and pulling. The planks beneath me groaned in protest, and I stumbled, barely catching myself on the railing. "Hurry," the figure commanded. "The crossing is incomplete." I pushed myself forward, my legs screaming in protest. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of the entire world was pressing down on me. The shapes in the mist grew clearer as I approached the far end of the bridge. They weren't human, not entirely. Their limbs were too long, their faces too smooth, their movements too fluid. They watched me with unblinking eyes, their gazes piercing and hollow. That I hesitated, my fear threatening to overwhelm me. But the shadowy figure stepped closer, its presence towering over me like a living storm. "There is no turning back," it said, its voice soft but final. As I took the final step, the world seemed to shift around me. The mist parted, revealing a landscape that defied comprehension. An endless expanse of dark, churning water dotted with towering spires of black stone. The sky above was a swirling vortex of gray and green, its clouds crackling with faint, unnatural light. The figures in the mist surrounded me, their silent presence pressing against my mind. "You are the bridge," the shadowy figure said again, stepping forward to stand at my side. Its form began to dissolve, the shadows unraveling and seeping into the ground. "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. But before it could answer, the ground beneath me shifted, and the figures surged forward, their arms outstretched, Their hands were cold. Not cold like winter or ice, but a deep, primal cold, as if they carried the chill of the void itself. When the figures touched me, the sensation shot through my body like needles of frost. Numbing and searing at once, I tried to pull away, but their grip was unyielding, their elongated fingers wrapping around my arms, my shoulders, my legs. Their faces were blank and smooth, save for the unblinking eyes, hundreds of them, scattered across their skin like a macabre mosaic. "You are the bridge," they said, their voices overlapping in a haunting harmony. "You will bind the worlds." The shadowy figure stood a few feet away, its form now little more than a flickering outline. "This is your purpose, Michael," it said, its voice distant and fading. "You were chosen to cross, and now you must hold." "I don't want this," I shouted, struggling against the figure's grasp. "I never asked for this." The figures didn't answer. Instead, they began to pull, dragging me toward the edge of the platform at the far end of the bridge. I fought, digging my heels into the wet, slick ground, but the figures moved with inhuman strength. The mist thickened around me, coiling and twisting like living smoke, and the whispers rose into a deafening roar. "You will bind the worlds," they chanted, their words vibrating through my bones as I neared the edge. The black water below surged violently, its surface churning with waves that defied gravity, rising and falling like the breath of some immense, unseen creature. The eyes beneath the surface glowed brighter, their hungry gazes fixed on me. The black veins on my arm burned, spreading farther across my chest and neck, their tendrils writhing under my skin. I could feel them burrowing deeper, connecting to something vast and alien within the void. And then I heard it, a voice. Not the whispers or the shadowy figure, but something deeper, older. It resonated through the water, the air, the bridge itself. A voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "You will anchor the crossing." The figures pulled me to the edge, their blank faces inches from mine. Their eyes stared into me, through me, and I felt my resistance falter, my strength draining away. "Let me go," I whispered, but the words came out weak, hollow. The voice boomed again, shaking the very ground beneath me. "You are the threshold. You are the bridge." The figures lifted me, their hands impossibly strong, and I screamed as they held me over the edge. Below, the creature in the water surged upward, its massive form writhing with tendrils and eyes. The air was thick with the stench of decay and salt, and the roar of the water filled my ears for a moment. I thought they would throw me in, but instead, they held me there, suspended above the void, as the black veins on my body erupted with light. The pain was unbearable, a searing heat that coursed through my entire being. I felt like I was being torn apart and rebuilt at the same time, my mind fracturing under the weight of something too vast to comprehend. The creature's tendrils reached for me, brushing against my feet, and I felt an unbearable pull, as though the void itself was trying to claim me. "No!" I screamed, thrashing against the figure's grip. "Let me go!" But they didn't. Instead, they began to chant again, their voices rising in unison, forming a single, terrible command. "Bind the worlds." The light from my veins intensified, spreading outward in jagged arcs that cut through the mist. The figures recoiled, their blank faces contorting in what almost looked like pain. The shadowy figure at the far end of the bridge raised one arm, as though shielding itself from the light. "You must hold, Michael," it said, its voice sharp and commanding. "You must complete the crossing." "I don't understand," I shouted, the light surging uncontrollably around me. "What do you want from me?" The figure stepped closer, its form flickering like a dying flame. "To cross the bridge is to become it," it said. "You are the link between worlds. You will hold the tether, or both will fall into chaos." Its words pierced through the haze of my terror, and I realized the truth. I was no longer just a man. The black veins, the whispers, the dreams, it had all been leading to this. I had been chosen, marked, and now I was something else. "Why me?" I whispered, my voice breaking. The figure tilted its head, its shadowy form unraveling further. "Because you answered the call," it said, "and because no one else could." The tendrils of the creature below lashed out, wrapping around the bridge and shaking it violently. The figures holding me stumbled, their grip faltering, and I fell to my knees on the platform. The pain in my veins reached its peak, and the light exploded outward in a blinding wave. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the mist cleared, and I saw it. The two worlds, tethered by the bridge. On one side was my world, gray and lifeless, its shadows long and jagged. On the other was a realm of chaos, its sky churning with green and black clouds, its ground shifting and alive. The bridge was the only thing connecting them, its planks now glowing with the same light that coursed through me. I understood now that I was the anchor. The bridge wasn't just a physical structure. It was me, my body, my mind, my soul. I was the link holding these two worlds together, and if I faltered, both would collapse into the void. The shadowy figure stepped closer, its form nearly dissolved into the air. "You will hold," it said, its voice softer now. "You must." I nodded, though tears streamed down my face. "I'll hold," I whispered. The figures surrounding me retreated into the mist, their blank faces disappearing into the shadows. The creature below let out one final, deafening roar before sinking back into the water, its tendrils retracting. And then I was alone. The bridge was quiet now, its planks humming faintly with the light of my veins. The air was still, the mist settled. I stood at the center, staring into the churning void below. I was the bridge now. I would hold. Time passed differently now, or perhaps it didn't pass at all. I stood at the center of the bridge, the only stable point between two worlds, and I could feel the weight of them pressing against me. Every moment was a test of endurance, my body trembling as the two realms strained against the tether I had become. The black veins that had spread across my body were now a part of me, glowing faintly with the same light that pulsed through the bridge. The tendrils writhed under my skin, alien and alive. Yet they were what kept me whole, what allowed me to remain here. Ahead of me, the chaotic world churned with life and decay, its shifting forms both beautiful and terrifying. Behind me, my own world stood still, its silence oppressive, its shadows stretching endlessly. Both pulled at me, demanding my attention, my strength, and I held Dotati first. There were no visitors. I stood alone. My only companions the faint hum of the bridge and the distant growls of the creature beneath. But as time, or whatever passed for it here, wore on, I began to notice movement in the distance. They came from both worlds, from my world. They emerged hesitantly. Pale, hollow-eyed figures, their faces twisted with fear and confusion. They walked the bridge as if in a trance, their steps slow and unsteady. From the chaotic world came beings of impossible shapes, some humanoid, others entirely alien, their forms shifting and shimmering like reflections in rippling water. Both kinds of visitors stopped at the center of the bridge, where I stood. They stared at me, their gazes filled with questions they didn't, or couldn't, voice. I tried to speak to them, but my words came out as whispers, barely audible over the hum of the bridge. And still, they stared, their eyes filled with the same unspoken plea. Why? The first time one of them tried to cross, I felt it. A man from my world, a gaunt figure in a torn suit, took a hesitant step toward the chaotic realm. The moment his foot touched the other side, a sharp, tearing pain shot through my chest. The black veins flared brightly, and I fell to my knees, gasping. The man froze, his body trembling as though caught in an invisible wind. Then, without warning, he dissolved into ash, his remains scattering into the mist. The figures from both worlds recoiled, their expressions a mixture of horror and resignation. The bridge wasn't just a passage. It was a boundary, and I was its gatekeeper. The shadowy figure returned one day, or perhaps it had always been there, watching from the edges of the mist. Its form was more solid now, less like a flickering shadow and more like a tangible presence. "You are learning?" it said, its voice softer than before. "Learning what?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "That not all crossings are meant to succeed." Its words filled me with a cold, hollow anger. "You never told me this," I said. "You never told me what this would cost." The figure tilted its head, its expression unreadable. "Would you have chosen differently?" I wanted to scream at it, to lash out, but I couldn't. The truth was, I didn't know. "What happens if I fail?" I asked instead, my voice trembling. The figure's form rippled, as though struggling to maintain its shape. "Then both worlds fall," it said simply, "and the void consumes all." The visitors kept coming, drawn to the bridge by some instinct they couldn't resist. Some stayed at the edges, watching silently. Others tried to cross, their forms disintegrating the moment they stepped into the opposite realm. Each failure tore at me, the pain carving deeper into my soul. But then, one day, something changed. A child appeared. A girl, no older than 10, her hair a tangle of black curls. She emerged from the chaotic world, her small, delicate form almost swallowed by the shifting mist. When she reached the center of the bridge, she stopped and looked up at me. Her eyes weren't like the others. They weren't hollow or alien. They were warm, filled with curiosity and something I hadn't seen in what felt like an eternity. "Are you the bridge?" she asked, her voice soft and clear. I hesitated, the question piercing through the fog in my mind. I suppose I am." She tilted her head, studying me with a childlike intensity. "Why do you look sad?" The question caught me off guard. "Because this is not what I wanted," I said finally. "I didn't choose this." She frowned, her small brow furrowing. "Then why are you here?" I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came. "I didn't know." "Not really." The girl reached out, her tiny hand brushing against the glowing veins on my arm. Her touch was warm, soothing, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the pain lessened. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" I asked, my voice trembling. "For holding it together," she said simply. Then she turned and walked back into the mist, her form dissolving into the swirling chaos. Her words stayed with me. "Thank you for holding it together." For the first time, I understood what I had become. Not just a bridge between two worlds, but a balance, a keeper of order. The weight was crushing, yes, but it was also necessary. Without the bridge, without me, both worlds would fall into the void. And so, I stood. I don't know how long I've been here. Days? Years? Centuries? Time is meaningless on the bridge. The visitors still come, their faces filled with questions, their bodies pulled by the same force that brought me here. Some try to cross, and the pain of their failure carves deeper into me each time. But others simply watch, and a few, like the girl, leave me with words that linger. The shadowy figure is gone now, its purpose fulfilled. I am alone. And yet, I am not. The bridge hums beneath me, its light pulsing in time with the black veins in my skin. The void stretches endlessly below, and the two worlds pull at me from either side. But I hold. I will always hold.